Hello, everyone. We're just giving everyone a second to connect. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jill Family. I am the Commonwealth Professor of Law and Government at Widener Law Commonwealth in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I also direct the law school's Law and Government Institute. And I want to welcome you to this very important panel on the federal civil service that is a part of the ABA's administrative law section's efforts to recognize public service. And while public service, I think officially only gets a week, there's Public Service Recognition Week, we at the ABA Administrative Law section have decided to celebrate public service all month. So even though it's not technically still Public Service Recognition Week, we wanted to put this panel together to be able to discuss important and challenging issues that are facing the federal civil service. I want to thank Ann Kiefer and Ian Kaplan, who are staff members at the ABA Administrative Law section, who helped make this presentation possible. And I should also mention that in addition to my duties at the law school, I'm the vice chair of the ABA Administrative Law section. So welcome to everyone. And I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to give each of our panelists a chance to speak for about 10 minutes or so, which will leave about 20-25 minutes for your questions. You can put any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, and I, as the moderator, will see them in the chat, and I will pose them to our panelists during the Q&A section. So if you have questions at any time, you can just throw them in the chat. I'll see them, I'll be collecting them, and I'll pose them to our panelists. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. So first, we'll be hearing from Tristan Levitt, who is the General Counsel and Acting Chief Executive and Administrative Officer of the United States Merit Systems Protection Board. He is also a government member of the Administrative Conference of the United States. And in previous jobs, he's worked for the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary, the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. And so we're really eager and glad that Tristan is here, and he'll be able to share with us some information from his perspective, all of that government experience. Next, we'll be hearing from Professor David E. Lewis, who is the Rebecca Webb Wilson University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science at Vanderbilt University, where he also is a professor of law. And his research interests include the presidency, executive branch politics, and public administration. He is the author of 2 books, Presidents and the Politics of Agency Design, and the Politics of Presidential Appointments, Political Control, and Bureaucratic Performance. He has also published numerous articles on American politics, public administration, and management. He's a member of the National Academy of Public Administration, and he's earned numerous research and teaching awards, including book awards from the American Political Science Association. He currently serves as the president of the Southern Political Science Association and president of the Midwest Public Administration Caucus. He serves on the editorial boards of Presidential Studies Quarterly and Public Administration. And then next, we'll hear from Professor Ann Joseph O'Connell, who is the Adelbert H. Sweet Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. And she is a lawyer and a social scientist. She has a PhD in political economy and government. And her research and teaching focuses on administrative law and the federal bureaucracy. She is a contributor to the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution. And she is an appointed senior fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States. She is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Public Administration, and an elected member of the American Law Institute. Professor O'Connell's research has received a number of awards, including she is a two-time recipient of the American Bar Association Scholarship Award in Administrative Law. Professor O'Connell clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Judge Stephen F. Williams of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and she was a trial attorney for the Federal Programs Branch of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Division. So as you can tell, we have gathered three amazing speakers and that are uniquely and perfectly situated to lead us in a discussion of this topic. So with that, Tristan, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jill. I'm very happy to have been invited to participate on this panel and to be able to recognize the contributions of the Federal Civil Service. During Public Service Recognition Week at the beginning of this month, I joined with 62 other department and agency heads in a release that noted how critical public servants are in our nation and how our federal civil servants often fail to receive recognition for their efforts. So for those federal civil servants watching today, if you get nothing else out of our panel, please accept our gratitude. The particular theme today is confronting challenges and searching for solutions. As the only employee on the panel restricted by the Hatch Act, I hope not to get caught in crossfire if my colleagues here today talk politics. However, I do want to spend my time talking about the role of politics, one of the topics that was advertised in the ABA section's flyer for today. This debate about the role of politics in the federal workplace played a central role in giving us the outlines of our modern government personnel system. But the principles involved were recognized by some of the first American leaders. In his earliest weeks in office, President Washington wrote in a letter, quote, "Hitherto, I have given no decisive answers to the applications of any candidates whatsoever, nor would it be proper for me, before I can have a general knowledge of the competitors for them, to say anything that might be construed as intended to encourage or discourage the hopes with which individuals might have formed of success. All that I require is the name and such testimonials with respect to abilities, integrity, and fitness as it may be in the power of the several applicants to produce. Beyond this, nothing with me is necessary or will be of any avail to them in my decisions," end quote. Perhaps not surprisingly, immediately after the government shifted hands between parties in 1801, President Jefferson issued an executive order stating, "Freedom of elections being essential, it is deemed improper for executive branch officers to attempt to control for influence free exercise of the elective right. It is expected that federal employees will not attempt to influence the votes of others, nor take part in the business of electioneering, that being deemed inconsistent with the spirit of the Constitution." Now, these principles may not have been as widely understood as human liberty or representative democracy, but they were born out of the experience of operating a government. Although the catch-all label of good government wouldn't be used until many, many decades later, the common sense behind these ideas was apparent. American government exists to serve the American public, and it should be staffed with the most qualified individuals who use their time on the job to provide the American public fair and impartial service they deserve. As my old boss, Senator Chuck Grassley, might put it, it ensures taxpayers get the best bang for their buck. These principles should have broad applicability in any era. President Jefferson indicated that his only questions when hiring employees would be, is he honest? Is he capable? Is he faithful to the Constitution? Yet, he also felt the need to remove some that he thought had been appointed by the prior administration on a partisan basis, a conundrum in the eyes of virtually every administration since. And so we were off to the races. As the allure of political party advantages, combined with the growing size of the executive branch throughout the first century of our government, even the pretense of even-handedness essentially went out the door. Yet, even as the president himself appointed a smaller and smaller percentage of federal employees, the patronage pressure on each succeeding administration grew and grew. I won't rehash the entire history of the 19th century spoils system, so consider yourselves lucky, but there are some gems to be excavated there. For instance, as early as 1826, even before President Jackson took the spoils system to greater levels than ever before, the Senate conducted an investigation of federal patronage and its misuse. In 1851, the Senate actually passed a resolution requiring that cabinet secretaries come up with a plan, quote, to provide for a fair and impartial examination of the qualifications of clerks and for promoting them from one grade to another on a due regard to qualifications and services. Now, the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 has rightly taken on immense significance in the history books as the statutory beginning of our merit-based civil service system. It represented a break with nearly 100 years of patronage politics in the federal government. Yet, as our national lore recounts, only after the assassination of President Garfield in the fall of 1881 did enough public pressure develop for Congress to look beyond the political interests of its main two parties and place the staffing of the executive branch on the firm footing of merit. Of course, the development of a career civil service system in the US was not straightforward at all. Much of the history was in fits and starts. A congressional appropriations writer in 1871 funded what became the beginning of the Civil Service Commission. That law authorized the president to prescribe rules for hiring in the civil service to, quote, promote the efficiency thereof. The rules developed included a prohibition on so-called political assessments. It was a practice requiring that federal employees pay a portion of their salary to a particular political party in order to retain their job. Today, we often think of civil service reform and the impulses behind the Hatch Act of 1939 as being two separate stories in American history. In fact, they were extremely intertwined up through the Reform era. After just a couple short years, Congress failed to renew the Grant Commission's appropriation and it shut down. Yet in the years immediately following, Congress actually strengthened the prohibition on political assessments, making it a criminal offense some 60 years before the Hatch Act. When President Arthur took office on Garfield's assassination, he not only lauded this law, he used part of his first message to Congress to announce that he would welcome its being further strengthened. Accordingly, the Pendleton Act expressly prohibited taking any personnel action, quote, for giving or withholding or neglecting to make any contribution of money or other valuable thing for any political purpose. This remains the basis for multiple federal prohibited personnel practices today. Of course, many of these changes, including the passage of the Pendleton Act itself, arguably came about because of partisan political dynamics all their own. Nevertheless, reading the public debate on each of these measures resonates so much because the same problems can arise through any era. Mark Robbins, who is the board member who hired me to MSPB from the Office of Special Counsel, recommended to me a wonderful small volume called Roosevelt the Reformer, a 2003 book by Richard Downing White. It covers Teddy Roosevelt's 6 years at the Civil Service Commission from 1889 to 1895, an often overlooked period of Roosevelt's career. I think reading the Edmund Morgan biographies of Roosevelt, it gets all of a very, very short amount of space there, and very little of it actually touches on the issues that they were dealing with at the time. But the challenges that Roosevelt faced in trying to keep politics out of the federal workplace would largely have been pulled out of the newspapers from any given presidency in the entire century since, including the time that I read the book. Similarly, although the Pendleton Act initially applied only to a very narrow set of federal employees, the numbers slowly grew over time. While it was admittedly sometimes with 2 steps forward and 1 step back, it didn't take long until it began to look more like the civil service system we have today. So why does all of this old history matter? You don't need to recall how Democrats and Republicans fared in the election of 1882 to remember that hiring and firing based on merit is the only way to ensure the federal government is staffed with the most qualified individuals. There's no need to peer into the pages of the history books for me to just imagine on my own what misuses of government time and resources would occur without the Hatch Act. That, without the Hatch Act, would unquestionably harm both parties. But history is a reminder that many of these debates have been had before. I think they're worth learning from. They can help point out paths for the future. And of course, they remind us how we got where we are today. The legacy that we have of our civil service one is a significant one. And I hope the United States will never forfeit that legacy. In closing, I want to echo Commissioner Teddy Roosevelt. The purpose of the Civil Service Commission is to secure an absolutely nonpartisan public service, have men, and of course today, women, appointed to and retained in office wholly without reference to their politics. In other words, we desire to make their honesty and capacity to do the work to which they are assigned the sole tests of their appointment and retention. I firmly believe this should continue to be our goal today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Next, we're going to hear from David.
Great. Well, I enjoyed, I wanted Tristan to go on about Teddy Roosevelt and the Civil Service Commission. I think that's I can say that probably for all of us here on the panel. But that said, I probably should speed us forward a little bit. And I want to talk about the challenges confronting the modern civil service and focus our attention more on this modern era than this earlier period. So starting with these principles, what do things look like today? And I think it's an important time to, when we recognize the work of civil servants, to also talk about the challenges and how we can establish this system moving forward in a healthy way, the way that Tristan suggested it started from. So I'm going to focus on three trends that may not, we're focused, I think, so much on in the current moment on the sort of day-to-day stories about what's happening in the administrative state. And I want to focus on three larger trends that kind of shape and define our current moment. The first trend I want to highlight for you is the dramatic growth in government, but no comparable growth in the federal workforce. Let me say that again. The federal government has grown dramatically in terms of its scope and the volume of its work, but the federal workforce is about the same size. So federal government is spending 5 times as much now as it did in 1960 in terms of real dollars, but the federal workforce is about the same size as it was in 1960. This is something John DiIulio at Penn pointed out several years ago, but it's worth remembering that the government has taken on new responsibilities in areas like the environment and workplace safety and national security and financial regulation and social welfare provision, but without a comparable increase in the federal workforce. So the federal workforce today is different than it was in 1960. Its responsibilities are greater, and the way that it carries out its work is different. Now, there are a number of reasons for this growing gap in terms of government activity and the sort of stability of the federal workforce. One of them is that a lot of the dollars that the federal government spends goes directly to recipients. So it's the entitlement programs where dollars run directly to recipients. It's also the case that the federal government has changed the way that it does its work so that now, rather than federal employees carrying out government jobs, state and local government employees do that work, or nonprofit or for-profit contractors do the work of government. And then, of course, the kind of the productivity of workers has changed over time. So we need fewer clerks and typists than we did in 1960. But even given these things, it's certainly true that the amount of work and the amount of dollars that federal employees are responsible for has grown dramatically without a comparable increase in the size of the civil service. And that's consequential for understanding what civil servants are doing and how they're doing it. The second trend that I want to highlight is, I would say, a decline in the perceptions of the health of the workforce. One way to get a handle on this is I've done surveys with colleagues over the last 3 presidencies of federal executives, the people like Tristan that are running offices or programs. And we've asked them questions about the workforce and about the people that they work with and what are the conditions that you're experiencing day to day. And I want to highlight for you responses to 2 questions that we asked in these different surveys and how they've changed over time. The first question we asked federal executives, and this is both appointed and career, is whether they agree with the following statement. An inadequately skilled workforce is a significant obstacle to my agency fulfilling its core mission. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? In the 2020 version of this survey, 60% of federal executives agreed with this statement. They said, yeah, a problem in our workforce makes it hard for us to carry out the core mission that Congress and the president have given us to do. This is up from 39% agreeing with that statement in 2014. We thought in 2014, this was a really high percentage of respondents that said that they were concerned about the skill level of their workforce, but it's increased in that time period. Now, this is something that I think is not a surprise to many of us in terms of, I teach public administration. And so getting good, bright young people into the government workforce is one thing. We're concerned about retention on the back end. But there's a concern overall about whether we're being attentive enough to the care and feeding of the civil service and the people that are carrying out programs that Congress and the president have authorized to carry out. The second question related to this is we asked federal executives to evaluate the people that they work with and how competent they were. So how competent are the political appointees that you work with, the senior civil servants that you work with, the low to mid-level civil servants that you work with, on a scale of 1 to 5. What do we find? Well, across the surveys, people think senior civil servants are terrific, right? They're all on average over, the average responses across agencies and across executives is over 4 out of 5. And that's great. What's worrying to us is that across all of the categories between 2007 and 2020 is a decline in the perceptions of the competence of those groups of federal employees. So political appointees are rated lower in 2020, senior civil servants are rated lower in 2020, low to mid-level civil servants are rated lower in 2020. So they're still high, but the trend is worrying. And that's not entirely surprising as well, given the things we know from the Government Accountability Office reports on workforce skill gaps, recruitment problems and retention, and the growing list of programs on the high-risk list. So there's an issue here with regard to, is the government able to do what voters ask the government to do? Are they able to carry out the programs? And part of that is the health of the federal workforce. The last trend I want to highlight is just one related to the ideologies of concern for, or the way we approach the health of the civil service. Republicans and conservatives, back when conservatives were sort of spread across the two parties, have been concerned for a long time about what the national government did, believing it should be smaller, that the scope of responsibilities of the national government should be more limited. But I would suggest that in this sort of earlier period, Republicans and Democrats shared a sense that while they disagreed about what government should do, there was a general agreement that if it did it, it should do it well, and that there was an obligation to be attentive to making sure that programs were effectively managed. Starting in the 1980s, both Republicans and Democrats began to adopt a series of management attitudes, what we sort of loosely call the new public management, that emphasize things like competition, privatization, customer focus, and these will sound familiar. I think reinventing government was sort of one example of this. And that was sort of a broadly shared notion based on this idea that the administrative state was bloated, it could be more effective, it could be more efficient. And that was kind of shared across the parties. But in recent times, there's been an increasing, I would say, anti-statism in the approach to the departments and agencies of government and the people that populate them. And I think when somebody like the president's former advisor, Steve Bannon, says that one of the goals of the administration is the deconstruction of the administrative state, there is a sense in which there's an increasing number of people, and it often splits along partisan lines, of folks who want to throw sand in the gears of government, that they want to make it difficult for agencies to carry out the laws that Congress and the president have given them to do. And sometimes that involves policies related to the civil service. So what are the consequences here? I just want to highlight for you quickly that most federal programs are overwhelmingly popular with voters. At some point, a majority of the House, a majority of the Senate, and the president agreed that this policy was a good idea and put it into place. If we don't pay enough attention to the civil service and the health of the civil service, we put many of these programs at risk. Veterans may die waiting for health care. Poor kids don't get enrolled in programs that feed them and teach them to read. People who should not get into the country on no-fly lists get in, or people who should be able to get in as visitors cannot get in. Federal employees waste dollars in procurement. And these kinds of problems emerge because we're not attentive to the care and feeding of the health of the administrative state. Again, conditional on, we can disagree about what the government should do, but probably not about whether it should do it well. And the last point I want to leave you with is something that Michael Lewis talks about, I think, interestingly, in his book, The Fifth Risk. And it's kind of just like a side point, but he sort of points out, look, federal employees created the internet, they created GPS, they put a man on the moon, they rebuilt Europe after World War II. The Partnership for Public Service notes that a quarter of Nobel Prize winners in the US have been government employees. And what Lewis points out, he says, what are the opportunities we're missing by underinvesting in the administrative state? What internet level accomplishment or realization or discovery are we foregoing by not being attentive enough to the health of the civil service? And so those are the kinds of things I have been thinking about. Hopefully we'll frame the discussion.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder that if you have a question, you can put it in the chat at any time and I'll be able to see them. And when we get to the Q&A portion of the program, I will present your question to our panelists. So now I'm going to hand things over to Anne.
Thank you, Jill, and thanks to my fellow panelists and to all of the attendees. My very first job was working on the civilian side for the U.S. Army in high school, and I worked at Fort Belvoir for 7 summers. So I'd like to briefly address 2 topics before we move to the Q&A period. First, to talk a little bit about the attacks on the career workforce in federal agencies, and not just in the last administration. And second, how senior career workers have stepped in to fill vacancies in top political positions in agencies. So I'll start with a little bit on the attacks on nonpartisan agency workers, and just a preliminary tiny technical point. We've been using in the webinar the term civil servants, but of course that label is not always technically correct because we have 3 appointments processes in the government, including the senior executive service, the traditional merit civil service competitive process, and then the accepted service. And of course, many in the accepted service kind of follow many of the principles that Tristan talked about. So in recent years, we've witnessed numerous interventions that have undermined career workers' morale and willingness to serve. And so I'll just flag a few. Number one, there are a lot of barriers to shifting agency procedures and policies. And so in light of those constraints, presidents like to reorganize the federal bureaucracy, or at least try to. And when that's done without sufficient buy-in from agency workers, morale and operations suffer. So just in the last administration, the Department of Agriculture sent most of its Economic Research Service and National Institute of Food and Agriculture from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. The Bureau of Land Management sent its headquarters staff from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado, or perhaps more accurately, the agency sent the positions away, but the people didn't follow. For just one example, with the Bureau of Land Management and its headquarters staff, close to 90% of affected workers quit or found other jobs. A second kind of line of attack, separate from the last administration, is that Congress has largely tamped down meaningful growth in agency budgets and employee pay. And so the 2011 Budget Control Act placed yearly limits on discretionary defense and non-defense spending through fiscal year 2021. And the act enforced these caps through sequestration, which is basically automatic spending cuts. And this drove downsizing and froze hiring in some entities. And that also contributed to lower agency morale and government operations. And as Dave discussed, we've had this hovering of the federal workforce around 2 million employees since the mid 1950s. And so we're seeing instead that work being taken up by private contractors, state and local governments, and non-governmental organizations. Third, and this is also in part about the last administration, but also administrations before that, Congress and the White House have increasingly failed to keep the government open. So there have been 21 government shutdowns, some of which have been partial, since 1976. And in the most recent one, which lasted weeks from December 2018 to late January 2019, close to 400,000 federal workers were furloughed, and over 400,000 essential workers had to work despite not being paid. Fourth, and finally, in terms of kind of attacks on the career workforce, and this is specific to the last administration, we saw a series of directives that undermined the career workforce, right? So President Trump started off his term with a nearly 3-month hiring freeze. In 2018, there were 3 executive orders that made it easier to remove federal workers, that cut the time that workers can spend on union activities. and that renegotiated contracts between agencies and their unions. And then in 2020, President Trump tried by executive order to create a new Schedule F, which would have moved considerable numbers of career employees in confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating positions out of the competitive service and into a new series of the accepted service with no protection from removal. Now, President Biden has since rescinded those 4 executive orders. So I want to turn, so those are kind of challenges and attacks. I want to turn briefly in my final few minutes to a different subject to talk about, like, despite these intentional or unintentional measures undermining agency workers, of course, the federal workforce has continued to serve the public in critical ways. And one of the ways that has received little attention but raises interesting issues, and this is where senior career officials are stepping in to fill political roles while our dysfunctional political appointments process churns, right? So these officials usually stand in for short periods, but some serve for extensive stints. So since 1998, we've had the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, which permits certain officials, first assistants, other Senate confirmed appointees, and qualifying senior agency workers, both political and career, to temporarily fill covered Senate confirmed roles. So the time limits for these acting officials can extend to several years if the White House submits formal nominations. And when the time limits run out, the agencies can typically delegate the non-exclusive duties of those vacant political positions downward, and they often get delegated downward to career workers. So I just want to spend a moment talking about acting officials from this 3rd category of the Vacancies Act, these senior agency workers who've worked in the agency for at least 90 days in the year preceding the vacancy and are paid at least at the GS-15 level or higher. The 1998 Act marked a change, right? Because that allows kind of career non-confirmed individuals to serve in acting capacities. So if you look from the middle of the 19th century to 1998, previous versions of the Vacancies Act typically restricted acting titles to first assistants and other Senate confirmed officials. And we're seeing these career workers step up into incredibly important positions. And the most incredibly important positions are cabinet secretaries. And so both President Trump and President Biden turned to senior career agency workers at the start of their administrations for these acting cabinet secretary roles. So when on his first day, President Trump received only 2 confirmed secretaries from the Senate. For the remaining 13, he relied on 4 Senate confirmed officials from the Obama administration, but then he relied on 9 career officials. And at the Departments of Agriculture and Treasury, those career acting secretaries served for months. President Biden had 0 confirmed secretaries on his first day. So he started with 15 acting secretaries, 2 of which had been confirmed in the previous administration. But then he had 13 non-confirmed agency officials at the start, 12 of whom were drawn from the senior career ranks. And this is true if you go down, kind of down a level to other Senate confirmed positions. Just take the general counsel at the Environmental Protection Agency. Since that Senate confirmed role was kind of placed in the Office of General Counsel in 1983, from 1983 through the end of the Trump administration, there had been more acting general counsels at the EPA than confirmed or recess appointed ones. This is counting where you treat service across administrations as separate observations. So of the 17 acting general counsels at the EPA in this period, only 2 were Senate confirmed to other roles, 5 were political officials, but 10 of the 17 acting general counsels came from the career ranks. And so we also see the use of career officials as acting IGs, which is another role where we sort of also see kind of vast vacancies. And we have expert career workers stepping in. And although many like to criticize acting officials, the substitute teachers of the administrative state, in the words of the Partnership for Public Service, I think in certain roles, career workers don't fit the stereotype of the substitute teacher, but are playing fundamental roles in the functioning of the administrative state. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thanks you so much to Anne and Tristan and David for those very interesting comments. So we have some questions in the chat, and some of the questions sort of revolve around a theme of how do we protect the federal workforce. And so I'm going to sort of combine a couple of the questions into a broader question, and then I'll get to some of the more specific questions in just a second. And so the broader question, I think, is what kind of mechanisms exist within the executive branch to protect the federal workforce, and are those protections sufficient? So for example, David, you mentioned, what if you have an administration that wants to throw sand in the gears and to use their power to make government not work? What can an agency do in response to that?
Well, I'll let Tristan speak to the personnel protections. Obviously, there are rules related to whistleblowing that protect whistleblowers, that provide a vehicle for expressing concern that way. And obviously, there are personnel protections related to people's job description and collective bargaining agreements that protect worker rights as well. But your point is a good one, right? Which is if the elected leaders decide that they don't want to give the capacity to government agencies to do what Congress and the president have asked them to do, there are some limited resources that they have, right? So apart from the formal powers that they have, one of the things that we see government officials do is do a good job of data collection to collect good quality data, so that you could do things like create a heat map of problems across the government where the workforce is struggling or where we don't have the capacity to do what we need to do. And sometimes just the provision of information combined with the careful attention to the law and professional norms can sort of carry the day moving government agencies forward. But obviously in a democratic system, you're limited somewhat in what you can do, except to try to faithfully carry out, inform as well as you can. And in cases where something is immoral or sort of exceeds an ethical bound, then you have to take other actions as well, like stepping down. And we see that across party change administrations where folks encounter some difficulties, then they have to take other means, and you see some dramatic departures in a few instances.
Thank you. So we have a few questions that are looking for updates on the MSPB. So my understanding is the MSPB right now doesn't have any board members. So we're looking for sort of an update on what's going on with the MSPB, and what maybe are the Biden administration's plans for the MSPB.
Sure. So I can speak to probably half of that. And I mean, I was debating internally, but would you mind if I took a brief stab at the prior question too?
Go for it. Yes, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I certainly didn't jump in. Again, as Dave mentioned, clearly there are personnel protections in place, and many of those have been essentially in place since the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. So, there are entities like the Office of Special Counsel, my former agency, that investigates prohibited personnel practices. So there are systems that are in place. The thing that I'm really hesitant about, but I'm just going to venture one thought, is part of the difficulty, right, reflects a lot of what we're seeing in the world around us of breakdown, right, and discord. And so there are much smarter political scientists on this call than me, but a lot's been written about the extent to which declines in checks and balances as envisioned by framers of the Constitution has led to more power being exercised by various parties in government, and that increases the stakes of things, right? And so on the one hand, I think that's, there's been a lot written about how that's contributed to kind of a zero-sum view of things. As it relates to agencies, it's tough because the growth of government, I don't want to sound too much like a stereotypical conservative here, right? But, notwithstanding, I guess going to Dave's point, even regardless of the size of individual or the size of the workforce, right? Just the sheer amount that the government administers has grown so much. And so I think it's just challenging in that if people are coming at it from different political perspectives, how to work the levers of government, how to use those, I think has caused a lot of people to throw their hands up in the air. And I don't think that's limited to one party. And so to that point, clearly we've seen a strain of, well, we're not going to be able to drive the car, so let's just burn it instead. But, again, I think it reflects some really larger dynamics for our country and, the political priorities or the role of government that we see. So with Dave, you look like you want to.
Oh, I just was going to make a quick supplement to something you said that I think is quite interesting. And I think that people forget that in our separation of powers system, the administrative state and the civil service works not just for the president, but they work for the three branches, right? The three branches together are responsible for governance. Congress creates all federal programs, they fund all federal programs, and it would be surprising to people if they were sort of came from the 1800s and dropped into the 2010s, the way that the administrative state is sort of dominated by this narrative about the president as chief executive gets to tell people what to do. That's not the way historically the government has been run, and Congress has an obligation to run and make sure that these programs are effective as well. So the relationship between civil servants and so career civil servants and political appointees is not just to one principal, the president, but it's to multiple principals. And that includes congressional committees that authorize federal programs and appropriate funds for them. And so when agencies encounter programs, they have multiple principals that should be informed about how things are going. And then it's the responsibility of the elected officials to work that out among themselves. But it's not as if they're responsible only to one party or one branch or the other.
So, and I think again, you could spend a whole hour on the administrative state, as it were, but as a former Hill staffer of 8 years, most of that doing oversight, I think one of the challenges, which again has been so written about that it feels stereotypical to raise it, right? But is the challenges Congress has in performing that kind of oversight, right? So there was a time when a committee chair, in fact, I think Senator Grassley's done this before, but it was much more common at a time to go hop in your car and go down to the Pentagon and figure out how things are working. And it doesn't work that way right now, right? And so there's a real challenge in, each of the branches has some unique challenges, but again, how you grapple with that with an administrative state, I think is what sets this up. Because at the end of the day, Congress doesn't have removal authority, right? And some of the big constitutional questions at the moment are, to what extent can Congress curtail the removal authority of the president? But, again, with a large government, I don't think it's controversial to say that Congress really lacks the tools to effectively exercise that kind of control that maybe Dave that the Constitution might have envisioned. That aside, so MSPB, there's been a notice of intent to nominate. That's not an actual nomination yet. It was the same day as President Biden's not State of the Union address, his first address to Congress, joint session of Congress. And so Kathy Harris is the woman who there was announced the notice of intent to nominate. She's someone who has worked before MSPB before. We are awaiting 2 other nominees. So there are, as most people probably know, there's 3 different slots here. They can't be more than 2 people from the same political party. So presumably there will be another Democrat and another Republican. I can't pretend to have any insight at all into what the Biden administration's plans are for MSPB. I will say during the transition period, we tried to be as forthcoming and just to describe in as much detail as we could some of the challenges that it creates for the agency without board. Sorry, I need like a lot of water here. Without board members. Apologies. And I think people got that. So we're just still in this limbo of sorts, right, of waiting for nominees. I will say that they're dying here. There were nominees in the last administration, and they ran up against the Shoals in Congress. I have heard from both sides of the aisle on the Hill. I think there is a much higher likelihood of nominees getting through. So I am fairly confident that we will have board members, ideally no later than the end of the year. And well, I guess, I think before the end of the year and ideally before that, but that's really where things stand.
Anne, did you have anything you wanted to add, what we've been talking about before? I also have a question really open to anyone about administrative law judges and recent Supreme Court opinions that have cast some question into the appointment and the job security of administrative law judges. So I don't know if any of you want to take that question on about protections for administrative law judges, or even specifically administrative adjudicators within the Merit System Protection Board.
Tristan, there are some questions with respect to sort of the appointment process within the MSPB. Do you want to take those on? I'll just say very briefly, I think after the decision in Lucia, that administrative law judges are considered to be officers. And so that affects how they are selected. And so moving them into the accepted service would be a kind of correct response to that decision. I think there are open questions about what happens on the back end, right? So the court has weighed in on the front end, but the Supreme Court has yet to weigh in on the back end. In terms of removal protections, right? So you have many administrative law judges who have basically double for-cause removal protection. And I assume that issue will be resolved by the court. And that could then affect kind of removal protections.
So I don't really actually want to address appointment procedures within MSPB, frankly. Given the litigation that we're in, but I think what's probably helpful to folks to know, or I hope is helpful, is for those who aren't familiar with the Lucia decision, it addresses the appointments clause, and of course you have principal and inferior officers, and some of those same questions have been raised. So principal officers have to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The question, a question is whether ALJs, which is what was examined, constitute inferior officers. There have been other arguments made and other things that are being looked at in terms of, what might constitute principal officers, for that matter, given the level of authority that's exercised by various officials. So if administrative judges at MSPB were found by courts to be similarly situated, exercise similar authorities, or have similar appointments to ALJs, that would put them under the purview of Lucia and under the appointments clause. And so, MSPB, it's clearly significant. It would be a significant development for MSPB. So we are closely watching, developments there.
Thank you. Another sort of line of questions is questions about, do we really need to have a distinction between the accepted service and the competitive service? So, and I guess this also relates to some questions about the Trump administration's proposals to, sort of push more people out of the competitive service into the accepted service and to decrease some of the protections. So I'm wondering if any of you want to comment about that. I mean, maybe David, I'll throw this to you first. Why do we still need this distinction?
Well, let me say, I think there's kind of a larger issue here, right? Which is that the system that we put into place with the Pendleton Act under Title V is still the system that's in place. And what we've seen historically is efforts by Congress to grant exceptions to Title V. So lots of agencies have the ability to make appointments outside that system. There are certain kinds of employees that can be hired outside that system. So there's been a fragmenting and fracturing of the Title V-based system because of its sort of inadequacies, I would say. And so there have been both changes within Title V, and then there's been this fracturing. And I think that what that suggests, right, is that, and there's a reason why many of the sort of folks that work in this space, whether it's the Volcker Alliance or the Partnership for Public Service, are advocating some wholesale rethinking of the way that we do federal personnel. And I'm in favor of that. I think that we have a system designed to protect us from abuse rather than to empower government to meet the sort of needs of the sort of statutes and laws that Congress and the president put into place. And we need a fundamental rethinking of our system in a way that is flexible enough to sort of respond to market demands, but also guarantees merit. And I think that the point that was in the comment about, really how many civil service exams are there really, and aren't we mostly moving toward a system based on resumes is right. But many of the sort of rules that are still in place are sort of a residue of kind of ad hoc or sort of responses to particular problems at particular points in time. So I take the spirit of that question and I sort of say, yes, there's probably a need to kind of rethink these distinctions that exist now.
Can I add a thought to that? If I can get through a sentence here, but one challenge that I think we see as it currently stands, and I guess one admonition I'd have in keeping with my earlier message is whatever we do, I think it's important to remember the framework within which we're trying to do it. And again, the reason that we have a merit system. So, having been in meetings before where the question comes up, well, how do you hire under the accepted service? And you can attribute this to a lot of things, right? A kind of micro narrative might have, some to do with OPM abandoning its federal personnel manual in the 90s, and depending on how granular you want to get, but a lot of HR specialists in the government, right? There's been some focus on so in the weeds rules that it's not people don't have the big picture in mind. You hire for merit, and so again, I heard this whole discussion on, well, you do this and you have to do that, and in terms of hiring attorneys or other accepted service, and again, it became very functional and without the big idea in mind, which is even if there are fewer restrictions, the idea is still that you're keeping, that you're hiring on the basis of merit. And if you drop that narrative, then you lose that. You lose the virtue of that and the benefits of that. And if you're so focused on particular rules, what they do allow or don't allow versus what's the big picture, why are we doing this?
Anne, did you want to jump in?
I'll just say that the MSPB put out a report recently looking at hiring under the competitive service, which I thought was really interesting. And that report showed that 30% of recent competitive service hires were done through direct hiring authorities. So kind of outside what we think of as the kind of stereotypical longer process to hire into the federal government. And the report also kind of noted some tensions, right, among different principles you might have, right? You want to get people in quickly, but you also want to adhere to these merit principles, and how, at least as I read the MSPB report, is that some agencies are using the direct hire authorities. And the idea is like, if you meet a bar, kind of if you're first in, you should be kind of first to hire. But they're kind of trying to kind of select among, and then that can raise certain concerns about merit principles as well. And obviously we need to think, right, we have lots of things in tension, and the traditional hiring process into the federal government is slower on average than the private sector. And especially as the workforce in federal agencies is much older on average than the general labor force, is we want to think kind of creatively about how to, of course, promote merit principles, but also get particularly young people into the federal government faster.
This is out of 15 seconds here. And one of the things that comes out clearly in the last version of the survey brings up this tension nicely. The number one problem that federal executives mention in recruitment is the time to hire. So there is this tension, I think, between getting people in quickly and then adhering to merit principles. And I think Anne's comments suggest that nicely.
And I think just from working with law students, I think the job applicants would probably agree with that result. I mean, just the USA Jobs is a daunting place to start your career. And I guess sort of related to that is a question about the public's understanding of merit systems. And this is a very intricate, detailed, complex area. And so do we know, or do you feel that the public understands what's at stake here or what the issues are? And if not, how do we go about better educating people who are not a part or don't study this system, what's at stake here?
Well, so I think it's probably fair to say that again, in many places the big picture has been lost, right? And so we just don't. The Pendleton Act was nearly 140 years ago, and so it's an old debate. And while it's been resurrected in various forms, right, it's been such kind of a standard pillar or standard assumption of our system. Although we've hacked at it in different ways, again, there's a lot of caveats you can look at there, but we just don't talk about it in the same way that we used to. And I think that's a challenge. I think your average member of the public doesn't really know. If you turn on the news or even down in the weeds stuff, again, it's either really micro level or just not touching on these things. So I think, again, telling the story of why merit is important is really important for government agencies to do, and anyone else that is in favor of good government.
I guess I would say here, one challenge is in a recent Pew survey, only a third of the American public can name all three branches of government. And so the idea that they understand the value of the merit system, it's unlikely that that's the case unless elected officials themselves explain the value of the merit system and trumpet the people who are successful. And I think that one of the things that we've lost that was, I think, used to be bipartisan was a shared understanding of what the values are that are inherent in government and the kinds of people and the value of public service and calling people to public service. And then it helps people understand then why these principles that Tristan talked about are important.
Anne, did you want to add anything to that?
I may think the Anti-Deficiency Act, which kind of restricts how agencies can spend money, also kind of restricts sort of how much self-promotion they can do. And I was struck by some work that John Michaels at UCLA has done. And he talks about how the military is allowed to use funding, to promote itself. So, there are these ads to encourage people, to join various branches of the military, but that other agencies can't do that. And so there is a kind of question, what if the EPA or, other agencies could kind of promote the work that they were doing, and also kind of, or maybe just more generally in the federal government, have promotion campaigns to get young people to join the federal government in particular, and that could help. Though I would also say in these Pew surveys, when you ask about the government generally, people are much more negative. But if you ask about specific agencies, like my favorite one, the Postal Service, people from both sides of the aisle are very positive. Though, of course, the Postal Service has taken a hit somewhat in recent years. But still, there are many specific agencies where people have kind of regular contact, where people are very happy about the government.
I couldn't tell at first, Anne, if you were remaking a music joke like we discussed earlier, but
oh no, I think the Postal Service really is my favorite agency.
So we have just a few minutes left, so I just want to give each of our panelists a chance to either make some concluding remarks or to maybe tell us, what's at the top of their priority list for reform. Let's actually start with Anne, and then we'll kind of work backwards.
Yeah, so I was just looking at some of the recent kind of comments/questions. I do think that the last administration put into sharp relief, or kind of sharply focused attention on the importance of career workers in the federal government, and how easily it is to attack them and to undermine them. And of course, we've had attacks and undermining in previous administrations as well, but I think the kind of combination, in my view, in the last administration was really startling. And so to think about bipartisan ways to protect and promote the career workforce in federal agencies, I just think is critically important. And we also see the kind of retirement cliff, right? As we see so many people eligible to retire, it's not just about protecting who we have, it's also making sure that we have people coming in, particularly younger workers, because the federal government does amazing things, and we want to have the best workers doing those things.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I agree with what Ann said. I guess I would say a couple of quick things. One is I think there's actually more agreement on what the issues are with the health of the civil service than we think. I think Republicans and Democrats agree on about 85% of it. I think that the facts have been known for a while. What's difficult is that they focus on different things in small pieces rather than sort of comprehensive reform. And so my hope is that there might be some sort of large scale, commission or something like that to recommend a new path moving forward. And I hope that that set of recommendations would include a proposal to cut the number of political appointees. We have so many Senate confirmed positions now that just languish without even their first nominee through 2 years into most presidential administrations. This isn't a Republican or Democrat thing. This is an institution thing, and the appointments process, as Ann said at the very beginning, is broken. And so I think some reform would include some reduction in the number of appointees.
Thank you. And Tristan?
Well, without a board, we're not really in the position of making policy recommendations necessarily, but my clear recommendation, would be to be able to receive a board. And I think having a quorum at MSPB is significant. There's a backlog of over 3,000 cases, and it applies to not only those federal employees and folks who have either been off the job for some period of time or who have been put back to work. But we cannot issue stays in whistleblower cases. Even where the Office of Special Counsel finds that that's a good idea. And so there's really a lot that is lost without a quorum.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists so much for taking the time to prepare for the panel, to be with us today. It was an amazingly interesting discussion. We are recording this panel, and it will be up on the Administrative Law Section's YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to attend and you think they'd like to watch it, you can look for it on the ABA Administrative Law Section's YouTube channel. So thank you once again to our panelists. From all of us at the Administrative Law Section, we sincerely appreciate your efforts.